On today's call, National Skills Coalition Federal Policy Director Rachel Gregg and Policy Analyst Angela Hanks will discuss what happened with the workforce development funding in the fiscal year 2013 continuing resolution, 2014 budget proposals offered by the President and Congress, and how those proposals may impact planned sequestration cuts. But before I hand things over to Rachel, I would like to take a moment to say thank you to all of our financial supporters calling in today. These updates are among the many state and federal policy resources that National Skills Coalition provides for those in the workforce field and are made possible by the generosity of our foundation and partners, organizational supporting members, and individual donors. We hope that those of you who have not yet invested in our work will consider joining the individuals and organizations across the country who have made their contribution to our common skills agenda, contribution to move our common skills agenda forward. You can join us at nationalskillscoalition.org/get involved to make an individual donation or become an organizational supporting member. Also, I want to let everyone know that today's webinar is being recorded. You'll receive an email later today with a link to the presentation recording. We've got a lot to cover this afternoon, and I want to make sure to make time for your questions. So without further delay, I'm pleased to turn it over to Angela Hanks. Angela.
Thanks, Josh. So as Josh mentioned, we're going to speak about what's happening with the FY14 budget process. But before we get into FY14, I'm just going to briefly go through where we ended up at the end of determining appropriations for the current fiscal year, 2013. So it may seem early because we're only in the fourth month of the year, but we're several months into fiscal year 2013, and we're just about 2 weeks into finishing up appropriations for this fiscal year. In March, at the end of March, Congress approved a continuing resolution that will continue to fund the government through September 2013, through the end of the fiscal year. The funding for FY13 included a small rescission, about 0.2% to all non-security discretionary programs. So that primarily means anything that would fall under the non-defense discretionary that we've talked about in past updates. So that will occur. That will slightly lower the funding for the remainder of the fiscal year. Also, this past month, sequestration went into effect on March 1st, as I'm sure you all know. Although sequestration went into effect now over a month ago, it may be clear to many of you that the cuts, there isn't an immediate effect to the cuts. More likely than not, when folks will start feeling the impact of the cuts is for advanced appropriated programs. The cuts will come out of the first quarter program year allocation July 1st. So even though the cuts technically went into effect on March 1st, it won't begin to affect those allocations until later on. However, because there is going to be this cut that's really effectively an entire year cut coming out of such a small period of time, planning is really critical because it will seem much larger than the 5.1 estimate that the administration has been using. I'd also point out that for a more detailed look at cuts, the Department of Labor recently put out a notice that just provided estimates for what they anticipate state-by-state cuts to be. There are a handful of states that will see increases. However, for some states, decreases in funding could be up to 30%. So I would invite you to our website to take a look at that notice, which I believe we have up on our RSS feed, and can provide some more details on what exactly the cuts will look like. The 5.1% number has been really more of a general estimate, but this is a little bit more accurate. So moving on to FY14. So the federal budget process just recently got underway about a month ago. So basically the federal budget, the purpose of it is to set spending priorities. So The House Budget Committee, the Senate Budget Committee, and the White House each develop their own budgets and set their own priorities for the coming year. The budget resolution is a rule, it's not a law, which means it does not have to be signed by the President. And basically it sets broad funding levels for the Appropriations Committee. So if you look at a budget, it won't say X amount of funding for WEA youth, but it will say making new investments in training or finding savings in certain areas within the budget. But it's very broad and doesn't include very many specifics on the programmatic level. Budgets are very important because they set priorities for the year for each body that creates their budget, and it also can include major policy changes. In years past, the FY 2011 budget resolution passed in the House, H.R. 1, included $4 billion in cuts, which included eliminating WEA, and eventually resulted in $1 billion in cuts. In 2012, there were $2 billion in cuts to DOL, $44 billion in Pell, with eventually $11 billion cut from Pell. And really, this is an emerging pattern year over year, is that we're seeing these budgets come out that really make some substantial funding cuts, and it's really being driven by this austerity framework that we're in right now. So I'm sure it can feel a little bit like Groundhog Day, but I'm not really sure we can predict when it will end. I think we could expect to see this for quite a while. So just to go over some key budget dates, as I mentioned, the budget committees in the House and the Senate released their budget resolutions in March, which both committees did this year. And then by April 15th, Congress is required to adopt a budget resolution. So this year, under the deal that extended the debt ceiling to May 19th, part of what that law included was a no budget, no pay provision, which essentially said that if either chamber fails to pass their budget through their own chamber by April 15th, then Congress would stop being paid. Fortunately for all of us and for members of Congress, both chambers were able to pass their own budgets by the April 15th deadline. However, following that, the passage on each side, the sides are supposed to come together to negotiate a concurrent budget resolution, which has not been done yet. Odds are that each leadership on each side will eventually appoint conferees to negotiate a budget resolution, but as we'll discuss a little bit later, really the budgets that have been put out by the House and the Senate are so far apart that it's difficult to imagine Congress being able to come up with a resolution that's satisfactory to both the House and the Senate. In addition to Congress releasing its budget, the White House also releases a budget. It's legally required to release a budget by February 4th. However, we're about 3 months late. The budget was actually released last week, which certainly affects what the House and Senate do with their budget, because generally the White House budget is quite a deal more detailed and can assist in developing the House and Senate budget. So having it 3 months late certainly creates issues and starts to push back the appropriations process, which should be getting started right about now. So the President's budget is certainly a valuable tool in this process, but I think its utility will be a little bit different this year because of how late it was released. So I won't go through all of this, but just to give a general idea of all of the key dates, really the budget process is, budget and appropriations process is about a year in the making. As you can see here, there are some really important dates. like when the budget is submitted to Congress from the administration, when members are allowed to give input to the Appropriations Committee on their priorities for the coming fiscal year, when the House and Senate must have their budgets completed April 15th, as I mentioned, and then in about a month, the House will begin work on annual appropriations bills. So, for instance, the labor age bill. So really diving into the specifics of how much each program will get in funding for the fiscal year, as opposed to, as I mentioned earlier, those kind of broad categories that are laid out in the budget. And then Congress will continue to work on appropriations through the summer, early fall, and the fiscal year 2014 will begin on October 1st. Ideally, how it's supposed to work is that all the appropriations bills are completed and passed by October 1st. In the past few years, it hasn't happened that way, so we've had these continuing resolutions funding the government. So the aim is always to get to that October 1st date, but it is not necessarily what always happens. So that's what Congress will be working toward, and then we will have to wait and see when they get it done. So as I mentioned, there's a House, a Senate, and a White House budget. So over in the Senate, Budget Chair Patty Murray, who is the new chair of the Budget Committee this year, recently put out her budget proposal for 2014. So Senator Murray's budget includes a number of things, but a few things that I wanted to highlight. It includes $10 billion in new funding for training. The language is a bit vague on what the funds would go toward, but it's certainly encouraging to see members of Congress making additional investments at a time where austerity is really ruling the day, and most of what we see is cuts. It also includes $1.85 trillion in new deficit reduction. Some of that deficit reduction would come from cuts to non-defense discretionary programs, and although National Skills Coalition, is not eager to see additional cuts to NDD, compared to the alternative, which would be even deeper cuts, this is probably one of the better case options for workforce programs. In addition, Senator Murray's budget eliminates all 9 years of sequestration, which would really do quite a bit of damage to programs over the next decade. So NSC was encouraged to see that she was able to deal with sequestration in a responsible way and even provide some new funding and new investments for training. In the House, House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan put out his budget, which is quite different from Senator Murray's budget, and as I said before, I think you'll see why it would be difficult for them to reconcile these two together. Congressman Ryan's budget includes $1.1 trillion in reduction to non-defense discretionary programs below the existing budget cap. So right now, we're operating under the Budget Control Act, which was passed in summer 2011, which set spending caps for non-defense discretionary programs. So already there's only so much that can be spent on NDD in a given year, and so this budget would reduce the amount allowable even further. Congressman Ryan's budget also endorses the Skills Act, which is WIA reauthorization legislation that was passed by the House last month, which would consolidate workforce programs into a single workforce investment fund. The House budget resolution also makes significant funding cuts to Pell, and it does this primarily by narrowing eligibility. So rather than just cutting the funds and everyone loses a little bit, really it'll affect non-traditional students, folks who are going less than half time. So a number of the people that are working and trying to get training will certainly be affected, would certainly be affected by those cuts to Pell. Congressman Ryan's budget also replaces the defense side of the sequester, but it does not replace the non-defense side of sequestration. And in fact, the NDB side would actually kind of have to take over the defense cuts as well. So although, as I mentioned, Senator Murray's budget would eliminate sequestration entirely, this would only deal with the defense side. So the President's budget, which was released, as I said, just last week, really has a number of details in it. It's really got a lot on deficit reduction, but it also has a lot more detail on specific programmatic requests, many more than, let's say, the House or the Senate budget would ever have. And Rachel will talk a lot more about some of those proposals and how those will relate to what the White House and Congress will do down the road. But I did just want to highlight a few things. So first of all, notably, the President's budget included about $79 billion $79 million in new funding for WIA formula programs. So this was certainly a pleasant surprise to see some increased investments in WIA, something that, like I said, in this framework is pretty rare and is unexpected. For the most part, workforce programs were relatively level funded in the President's budget. There were no real drastic cuts to any programs. And it also included some new programs as well that I just want to quickly highlight. These were all included in last year's budget, but none of them were enacted into law, so the President has kind of put them forth again in the hopes that, that Congress will take them up. So the first is the Community College to Career Fund, which would support partnerships between states, community colleges, and businesses for job training activities and filling jobs in high-growth industries. This would be jointly run between the Department of Ed and the Department of Labor, and would be the successor to the TAC grants, so the community college grants run through TAA currently, which are set to expire in 2014. The President's budget also includes the Pathways Back to Work Fund, which would support immediate employment and training activities for unemployed and low-income individuals. The fund would be about $12.5 billion and would go toward subsidized employment opportunities, competitive grants to design strategies to lead to employment, and additional funding for youth. So in addition, he would also propose the Universal Dislocated Worker Program, another program that was has appeared in the previous budget. This would really be the successor to the TAA worker program, and it would also pull out WIA dislocated workers from WIA formula funds and move dislocated workers into this program instead. The President has provided some details on the program and how it would work, but his main priority has to been able is to have one stop where dislocated workers can go to get services and to get training. So all of these proposals, of course, have to be approved by Congress. So while the administration has put them forward, so far there hasn't been any action on any of them in the previous year. So I'm certain the administration will continue to push them, and putting them in his budget is certainly a sign of where they fall on his priority list. It seems like the President is dedicated to getting these programs passed, but once again, it depends on the will of Congress.
Angela?
Yes?
Before you go on to the next slide, because a whole bunch of people are asking this question.
Sure.
$79 billion.
$79 million, yeah.
That's a typo.
Sorry about that.
$79 million, not $79 billion, which would be nice.
That would be nice.
But
yes.
Not going to happen.
That is a typo. So before I give it over to Rachel to explain some of the details on what's coming ahead in a couple months, so as I said, Congress will likely not agree on a joint resolution. There's really not a lot of places of agreement between the two budgets. There are a number of reasons for this. Like I said, these really set priorities, so they're really a tool for whoever is in leadership to explain their vision, that it's not necessarily a tool for compromise in many cases. So really what these budgets will serve as is a starting point for grand bargain negotiations this spring. The debt ceiling extension ends in May, and so it's likely that the President is going to try to push for another grand bargain. As you may have seen, conversations have already begun around this. The President has been inviting a number of senators to the White House to start discussions on what it would look like, and his budget includes many details on deficit reduction. So we'll definitely pay close attention to that, and Rachel can give you some more details on what a potential grand bargain would look like and what the timeline for that would be. So Rachel, oh, before we move on, so I know we had the typo about the $79 million, but we can take some questions now before we move into the second half of our presentation.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please type in your question into the question box on your control panel, or else raise your hand, which you can find that as well on your control panel. And if you raise your hand, I can unmute your line so you can ask a question. And it looks like we have a question from Carolyn Carter. I just unmuted your line. Go ahead with your question. Carolyn? All right. Well, if you do have a question, again, feel free to raise your hand or just type it in the question box. Another question we have, it sounds like WIA is not level funded if this initiative takes from WIA DW formula, correct?
So for this fiscal year, there's a slight increase to the WIA dislocated worker funding. Really, the dislocated worker program wouldn't take effect until, I believe, 2015. So this budget, although it proposes the broad plan for a universal dislocated program, because there's no legislation and there's no actual movement in Congress to develop this program, the budget just treats existing law as it is and funds WIA dislocated worker.
This is Rachel. I also want to just clarify. So TAA will expire at the end of this year, at the end of 2013. So Congress is going to have to take some sort of proposal up. I do think that the White House will push for this. They've raised it 2 times. The President has mentioned it in his State of the Union. You know, this idea of sort of one place where dislocated workers can go. So I do think that this will come up. Angela is correct. So in the current funding cycle, WIA dislocated worker actually gets a slight bump up, and that will be true because Congress won't take this up until the end of the year. So for now, WIA dislocated worker and the other WIA programs are level funded or slightly increased. But I think people should realistically expect to see this come back around.
All right, so we have a couple other questions here. One is the 5% planning the worst case scenario?
No. So I mentioned before, and I think it's on the first page of our site. I think the last RSS post has a link to it, and we can send that out with the presentation. The Department of Labor put out estimates for state by state for what the funding cuts would actually mean. So 5.1% is sort of a best guess. It was an estimate based on how they expected the cuts to work across the board. But really, now that it's come down to implementation, the Department of Labor has given some further guidance on what it will mean in each state. So rather than getting 5.1% flat cut in funding state by state, it will be incorporated into the formula that Department of Labor uses to allocate funding to each state.
It's also, the 5% was if you spread the sequester out over the course of a whole year's worth of funding. It would be 5% over 12 months. but because for the advanced appropriated fundings like WIA dislocated worker and WIA adult, it's not going to be spread out over the whole year. They're not going to try and claw back money that they've already given to you. The 3/4 worth of money that you've already received, they're not going to say you have to give us any of that money back. But to offset the fact that you don't have to give any money back, it's all going to come out of the money you get on July 1st. The full year's worth of the sequester will come out of that allocation. So you're squeezing 12 months worth of cuts into 4 months worth of funding. So that's why it's so much more than 5% also. And then it interacts with the formula. So some states, their formula would normally go up. Some states, their formula funds would normally go down. So you have the adjustments for your formula, and then you have this big cut in this little amount of funding. So that's why it looks the way that it does. It's still equivalent to about 5% over the course of the full year, but it's just because you're squeezing it down into such a short period of time that it looks so much bigger.
All right. Another question we have is, by having a single workforce-funded program in the Republican budget, what impact would that have on individual title programs?
I'm not sure it's clear at this point. In the Skills Act, there is an amount appropriated for the fund. However, it's not clear what would actually be enacted into law and how much would be appropriated each year. So I'm not sure we could say whether it would be necessarily less. It does make it more difficult to predict for sure, and we'll have to see as that moves forward what funding will look like.
And under the House proposal, there are no individual titles anymore, so there wouldn't be, I'm sorry, there are individual titles, so Title I.
Different streams.
Right, so the funding streams inside the title, so inside Title I, and the Workforce Investment Fund is really only about Title I. It doesn't do anything to Title II. It does, to the adult ed programs, it does eliminate Title III, the Wagner-Pizer funds. But so for adult, youth, and dislocated workers, there would no longer be those funding streams.
All right, so we have another question. My understanding is that a good part of the $79 million will be for an increase from 5% to 7.5% for the governor's discretionary set-aside. Would you please explain?
Yes, that's probably correct. I assume the increase is to help offset so that you aren't losing funds at the local level. Remember, 2 years ago, they reduced the governor's set-aside from 15% to 5%. That was very disruptive for a number of states, so they're trying to restore some of that funding, but they don't want to have to pull money back from the local level. So I think that's probably right, that the increase in the formula funds is to help offset that increase in the statewide set-aside.
Another question, when do you expect the final funding level data to be announced by DOL?
I don't know.
Okay, and I have a last question here. Will participants have to be TAA eligible to enroll in the Universal Displaced Worker Program?
No, it's a single program. It's supposed to affect anyone who has been dislocated. So you don't have to meet the same requirements that are in TAA right now. I'm not sure what the requirements would be, but I believe the administration is looking for a more general definition of what it means to be a dislocated worker.
Okay. I have a couple more questions, and then we can move on to hearing Rachel speak. One question, did you say that under the Skills Act, WP funding stream goes away?
Yes, the Wagner-Pizer funding stream is eliminated under the Skills Act.
Okay. And it looks like we have a question from Maury Herman. Well, actually, his hand just went away. So I guess, Rachel, if you are ready.
Okay, sure.
Great.
Okay, so Angela's going to help me advance the slide. So go on to the next slide, Angela. Right, so you've got 3 budgets that, as Angela explained, take very different sort of philosophical and ideological starting points and have very different sort of, numbers and funding levels in them. So we're going to start. I'm just going to take a little bit of a step back and talk a little bit about the context in which the budgets are being considered, right? So for right now, the sequesters and the budget caps are current law. So if nothing happens, if Congress doesn't take action, then the sequesters and the caps that we're under right now will just stay in place. So status quo is pretty bad for funding for programs like employment and training programs. And unless Congress proactively changes current law, then we stay where we are right now. The debt ceiling, which they suspended, so I don't know if you guys remember back to the fiscal cliff deal, we were approaching the debt ceiling in December and getting ready to default. Instead of actually dealing with it, they just said, you know what, we're just going to essentially turn off the law that controls the debt ceiling for just under 6 months. And so they didn't increase the debt ceiling, but they didn't. But it doesn't really matter right now because the government has the ability to pay its debts. Congress just said, you know what, we're just gonna look the other way, and you can just do what you need to do until May 15th. But on May 15th, the debt ceiling will turn back on, and then we'll be back in that same situation that we were in December when they didn't really deal with it, where we will be under this obligation where Congress, the federal government, can only pay its debts up to a certain amount, and then we risk defaulting on what we owe to other countries and to people who invest in bonds and other treasury products. It looks like it's not like on May 15th it turns back on and we fall off a cliff. There'll be a little bit of time where the Treasury Department can use what are called extraordinary measures to keep paying their bills, but we will pretty quickly move back to a point where we will be at risk for default. So sort of in the background of all this conversation is this looming threat that Congress is going to have to take some sort of action to deal with the debt ceiling again, or else we're at risk of defaulting on the debt that we owe. And there's a growing sense that Congress and the administration have to find a way out of this current cycle of sort of self-inflicted wounds, right? We can't sort of keep going from one fiscal crisis to another fiscal crisis, which we have been doing for about the last 18 months. Literally every 3 months or so, we're in the midst of another fiscal crisis, be it defaulting on the debt or risking a government shutdown, or everybody's taxes going up, and it's just an impossible way to govern, and it makes it very difficult for people to run their programs because you have no sense of what kind of funding you can count on, and I think people in D.C. understand that the general public is extremely frustrated with this and really feels very strongly that this is just we just can't keep going on this way, and there needs to be some sort of resolution that this is an unacceptable way to govern. So Angela, if you'll go to the next one. So it looks like what's going to happen is there's going to sort of be two parallel tracks running. So track number one is going to be this sort of regular order where they're going to go through the regular appropriations process, which Angela was just talking about, right? So the budget resolution sets the broad outlines for the appropriations process, and then the appropriators come in and they start figuring out the specific funding levels for the specific programs. And I think that's going to move forward, and it's going to move forward shortly. And then on a second parallel track at the same time, they're moving forward sort of through regular order on appropriations. They'll also, the White House and the House in particular, but also the Senate, but really we'll be back to that dynamic where the President and the House Republicans are sort of trying to negotiate, taking one more run at this grand bargain that they have tried several times. And it has been elusive up to now, but I think they're going to try, at least the White House is very committed to trying one more time. So we go to the next slide, Angela. All right, so let's talk a little bit about track one. As Angela mentioned, the House and the Senate budget resolutions are so far apart and take such, sort of inherently irreconcilable views of what the federal budget should look like that there's very little chance that they're going to be able to come up with an agreement that sort of takes the Senate budget and the House budget and finds some middle ground. Particularly given how stubborn the House and the Senate are, they're not really that interested in compromising, and both will sort of dig their heels in. So what's likely to happen is that they'll just go ahead and begin the appropriations process. The appropriators have the authority on May 15th. If there's still no budget resolution, they are allowed to just begin the appropriations process sort of based on what the budget resolutions the separate Senate and House budget resolutions say. So this is also interesting. So the Senate will move forward. The Senate budget resolution actually has about $1.06 trillion in overall discretionary funding. They are basically assuming they're under the budget cap, but they don't account for the sequesters. So they're just going to start from the $1.06 trillion funding level. The House includes the sequesters that are in place right now. They take that out of the funding levels that they have to work with. So they're starting at about $940 billion for their overall funding levels for this year's appropriations process. So you can see there's already, you're starting with this big gap between what the House will be appropriating from and what the Senate will be appropriating from. And at some point, they will have to try and figure out a way to reconcile that. But for now, probably in the next few weeks, you'll see them just start to move their bills forward. They'll start to do hearings and try and getting feedback and want to hear from people. But they'll be starting from these very different starting points. So if you want to go to the next slide, Angela. So like I said, they can start on May 15th even without a budget resolution. Senator Mikulski, who's the new Appropriations Committee chair, she's already publicly said that she plans to finish marking up all 12 appropriations bills in June and July. That's a pretty ambitious goal. I don't know if she'll actually be able to do that, although she is quite the taskmaster and has a pretty strong hand in her committee. So maybe she will manage to pull it off. It would be very impressive if she was able to do that. We expect the House will likely try to follow a similar timeline. They haven't really said anything publicly yet about what they plan to do, but in past years they have sort of tried, their goal has often been to try and have the appropriations bills done before they leave for the August recess. So this next few months will be very relevant to the FY14 appropriations process, and it will be important for people to be weighing in because they are going to have to make a lot of decisions about what programs get funded and what programs don't get funded in sort of the very near term. So you go to the next slide, Angela. And part of the reason why FY14, why it's going to be very important, it's important every year, but in FY14 it's going to be especially important that they're hearing from people is because the sequester is still in place, right? So every year for the next 9 years, there's $109 billion in cuts. $55 billion to defense programs, $55 billion to non-defense programs. But unlike in FY13, FY13 was the only year when the sequesters were taken as just straight across the board cuts. That is not going to be true starting in FY14 and for the remainder of the years when the sequester is in place. Instead, the overall cap, right? So there are caps that were put in place under the Budget Control Act. What the sequester will do for each of the remaining years is it will actually just lower that overall cap. So for the NDD programs, they'll just have $55 billion less under that cap. So what that means is that the appropriators, it's not going to be arbitrary, it's not going to be equally spread around, but instead the appropriators through the appropriations process, they'll have to decide where to implement that $55 billion in cuts and which programs they want to take funding away from and which programs they want to protect. So you can see job training is often pretty vulnerable, especially when they have to make decisions. Keep in mind, like when they're doing the labor HHS education appropriations bill, which is the bill that funds most job training programs. In that bill, there's a whole bunch of really high priority programs, including things like the National Institute of Health and IDEA, which is the education program for people with disabilities. There's a bunch of programs like that, which are very politically strong programs and which a lot of members of Congress care very much about. So it's often not the case that, you know, if you go and talk to a member, they'll say, I care very much about job training programs, but when I have to make my list, I have to come up with $55 billion in additional cuts now because of the way the sequester is going to function. And it's all bad, but I'm not going to cut NIH and I'm not going to cut IDEA, so that really leaves a limited number of programs where I can take these cuts. And that's often the dynamic we see with job training programs is that just as members have to prioritize, and they have to make these cuts, right? If the sequester, if Congress doesn't change the existing law, if the sequester stays in place, they have no choice but to make these cuts. And so when they're trying to figure out where the cuts come, it becomes a matter of just, you know, what is their highest priority, and it is often the case that the job training programs don't rise to that level. And just to make things a little bit more complicated, Pell Grants are now also in the mix. So in 2013, the Pell Grant program was exempt from the NDD cut, so it was sort of set aside and it couldn't be cut. Pell Grants are now vulnerable to the NDD cuts and are sort of part of that overall math now. And because the Pell Grant is so big, it's going to it sucks up a lot of the pot of money that's available. And I do think policymakers will want to protect it. So it just, in essence, it further squeezes what's left to take the cuts out of. So 2014 is going to be, I think, a challenging year for job training programs, and it will be very important that we continue to convey to policymakers why these investments are so important and why, we just can't continue to absorb the bulk of the cuts. So if you go to the next slide, Angela. Okay, so track 2, while the appropriations conversation is going on, while we're all weighing in and trying to influence that conversation, at the same time, you're going to see sort of at a very high level, at the leadership level, this effort to come back around to a grand bargain. So far we've made about $2.5 trillion in cuts since 2010, right? That was through the FY11 appropriations process. That was through the Budget Control Act. That was through the fiscal cliff deal. So there have been a series of laws that have been passed which have either cut funding or raised revenue. We've had about $1.9 trillion in funding cuts, about $600 billion in new revenue, so about $2.5 trillion in cuts total. But they're trying to come up with, the president in particular is very committed to coming up with another $1.5 trillion in deficit reduction in order to stabilize the debt. There are economists who have said if we could cut about $4 trillion total from our deficit, the rate of growth of the deficit will sort of level out, and it will buy us some time to sort of get out of the recession, get our economy going again, and then we can circle back to figure out the rest of our deficit reduction. But sort of now, to make sure that the economy is doing what it needs to do, there's this idea that we need to get to $4 trillion total. So we have about $1.5 trillion left to go to get to that total. Part of the idea of a grand bargain, like I said, is this idea that they need to stop lurching from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis. And if you can get that $1.5 trillion sort of out of the way, then we can sort of move away from just talking about the federal deficit and just talking about funding issues and deficit reduction, and actually turn to some of these policy debates that other people want to have. And definitely, I think Angela mentioned this, but the House, the Senate, and the administration's budget proposals are really, I don't think anybody sees them as like this is the budget that anybody expects to pass this year, and they're more ideological than they have been in other years. And I think that's not an accident. It's really because they are sort of the opening bids in this conversation. So the House is way far at one end where they're proposing very, very, very deep spending cuts. They don't have any real new revenue increases. They have a lot of entitlement reform proposals in the House budget resolution, so they'd make significant changes to food stamps, to Medicaid, things like that, where they've sort of, it's kind of like their wish list of all the things that they would do. The Senate is sort of at the other end with sort of their wish list of all the things that they would do with $100 billion in new investments for infrastructure and job training, significant new revenue increases, much smaller spending cuts, and then you've got the president's budget, which is sort of in the middle of that. And I think they have positioned themselves that way on purpose. So if you go to the next slide, Angela. So let's talk about the Obama budget, which, like I said, I think it was very intentional. It's almost like there are two parts to the budget that he introduced this year. So there's one that's really a 2014 budget where you see things like the Community College to Career Fund and the Pathways Back to Work Fund and the Universal Dislocated Worker Program, the funding levels for WIA, things like that. But then there's a whole other set of proposals in it that really are essentially deficit reduction proposals that aren't specific to FY14, but they're much more about what he wants to see happen in this grand bargain. And so you can look at the Obama budget and you can really see what he has in mind. So he proposes about $580 billion in new revenue, mainly by closing loopholes for upper income households. There is entitlement reform in the president's budget, and he's gotten a lot of grief about this. There are a lot of Democrats who are very, very unhappy that the president is sort of saying that he is open to considering entitlement reform, including about $400 billion in savings from health care programs. He has also said he would accept something that's called chain CPI, which is a Social Security reform, and there's a lot of people who are very, very upset about that. And then sort of parochially, if you're thinking about job training programs, for us the most important thing is that the President's budget would eliminate the sequester, and it instead cuts about $200 billion from the discretionary programs, $100 billion from the non-defense discretionary programs, and $100 billion from the defense programs. If you think about it, $100 billion in cuts over 10 years is actually much better than the current situation we face under the sequester, which is $55 billion a year in non-defense discretionary cuts for the next 9 years. So, you know, $100 billion is the equivalent of less than 2 years of a sequester. So the administration has been pretty clear that they think that the non-defense discretionary programs have already done their part. They've already made a lot of cuts and should not have to make a tremendous amount of additional cuts. So this is where the President is starting from. The White House has been pretty clear that they see this as a whole package, so they don't want to sort of pick it apart. So they would not, for example, negotiate the entitlement reforms without also insisting on the revenue reforms. They won't eliminate the sequester. So, right, so it all has to go together. It's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be the whole package from their point of view. If you go to the next slide, Angela. The sort of at the other end of the conversation is what was in the House budget, right, which is a less balanced approach. So keeps the current non-defense discretionary sequester, ends the defense sequester, which in fact it shifts those cuts over to the non-defense programs. As Angela says, it's about $1 trillion in cuts below the current caps. There are a lot of entitlement reforms, very deep, about $33 billion in cuts to the SNAP program, for example, and very, very, very deep cuts to job training programs. We can't, because it's at such a broad level, we can't say specifically exactly what the cuts would be, but we know from past budgets that, past budget resolutions, that it's very likely that the House would potentially come close to eliminating funding for most of the federal job training programs. So if you go to the next slide, Angela. So what is going to happen in this grand bargain conversation? Like I said earlier, the debt ceiling is going to turn back on May 15th. We will likely hit default sometime in late July or early August. So the Treasury Department will use extraordinary measures to bump us along, but they will be unable to continue to pay our debt probably sometime in late July or early August, and we'll be back in this position where we are at risk of defaulting on the debt. And that's really the key leverage point. Right, nobody in Washington wants to default on the debt. We came very close once before, and it made the markets very nervous. We got our credit downgraded. The United States got its credit downgraded as a result. And everybody understands that that's not really an acceptable place to be back, where we're at risk of that again. So this is going to be sort of the key leverage point, and it's going to sort of revolve around this. So between now and when we hit that risk of default, so July or early August, is when this is the window where they'll try and negotiate this grand bargain. And it's all going to work towards that, where you have to take action to increase the debt ceiling, and it's what do you get in exchange for increasing the debt ceiling? What kind of concessions will the House insist on? What kind of concessions will the White House insist on? So if you go to the next slide. Here's the other thing about the debt ceiling that is one of my biggest concerns, is that this thing called the Boehner rule has resurfaced. And the Boehner rule is something that came up in the last go-around with the debt ceiling, not the one in December, but the one in summer of 2011 when we passed the Budget Control Act. So the Budget Control Act, which is what created the sequester, that essentially enacted the Boehner rule. And the Boehner rule says that for every $1 increase that you make in the debt ceiling, you have to have an equal $1 spending cut. So if we increase the debt ceiling by $1 trillion, then we have to come up with $1 trillion in spending cuts. And this is beyond anything that has to do with deficit reduction, right? So if you assume that we have to bring down our current existing deficit, there's a whole conversation about how to do that, right? That's the conversation that we're having through the budget and through appropriations, and that's what the caps are supposed to be doing. And right, we're going to bring down the existing deficit. Separate from that, Speaker Boehner is saying that if you're going to increase the debt ceiling by $1 trillion, we're not just going to add that to our debt. Our debt is already too big, so we're going to have to offset anything that we do to increase the debt ceiling. You have to offset that. So that would mean we would have to come up with $1 trillion in additional cuts beyond the cuts that we're already making. So beyond that $4 trillion or whatever figure you come up with, this $1 trillion is in addition to that. And if you think about it, we have to increase the debt ceiling if the rate of growth stays more or less at what it is now, we have to increase the debt ceiling by about $1 trillion every year. So if we have to come up with $1 trillion in cuts every time we have to increase the debt ceiling, this is actually the thing that's like would keep me up at night, because there's no way we can do that. It's just not possible. Not only would job training programs cease to exist, but most of the federal government would cease to exist, because we can't. There's no place to go for $1 trillion in additional cuts every year. And there is real concern. People who are better at this sort of thing than I am, they have real concern. So the Boehner rule has been enacted once in 2011 as part of the Budget Control Act. That was, the Budget Control Act enacted the Boehner rule. And there's a real concern that if in this cycle the Boehner rule is it sort of is the guiding principle behind the debt ceiling debate. In this cycle, if it happens twice, then it sort of becomes a precedent. And people will just say, yeah, right, the Boehner rule, if we're going to increase the debt ceiling, the Boehner rule stands. And so I think there are a lot of people who feel like it's very important that the Boehner rule not guide this debt ceiling debate, because if it does, then it sort of becomes fixed and it becomes the expectation. And I will say, a couple weeks ago, the speaker did give a press event where he reiterated again his expectation that if we do increase the debt ceiling, we will do equivalent cuts. So he's already put down a marker that that the House plans to raise this Boehner rule again as we go into the debt ceiling debate. So it is really important that they find a way to get to a grand bargain that avoids this sort of crash into the debt ceiling and that avoids the Boehner rule. They really need to work this out. They need to sort of smooth out the funding process, because we're not going to be able to survive this if this is what we do over and over and over again. So Angela, if you'll go to the next slide. So what's going to happen? The short answer is I don't really know what's going to happen, and the longer answer is it depends on how things play out, right? So in part, I think it really matters how the current cuts impact local communities. There are a lot of people here in Washington who are saying that the sequester really hasn't had very much of an impact, that they aren't hearing from anybody that they're feeling the cuts. And there's a lot of people here who are saying, yeah, 5%, that's not so bad. Communities can absorb that. This is not such a big deal. There have been a few places where people have said, like with some of the closing of some of the control towers at some of the airports and things like that. But in general, there has not been a big outcry here in D.C. about what the impact of the sequesters have been. And I think part of that is because, as Angela mentioned, they didn't, it's not an abrupt cut that goes right into effect. I think it will kind of roll out a little bit more slowly, and I think over time communities will start to feel it more. But if it's pretty muted, and if it just sort of trickles out, and communities, there's not sort of a pushback from local communities, I think a lot of people in D.C. will think that so that wasn't so bad. We can just leave all of this in place. I think it depends on what kind of pressure there are on members of Congress to fix the cuts and what they're hearing from their local constituents. This is not new. You guys have heard this from us repeatedly, that if they don't hear from you, there's no accountability. They don't think it's a problem. And then I think there's just this whole political dynamic about who's going to blink first, right? So as we get closer and closer to the debt ceiling, there's going to be a lot of political maneuvering and finger pointing and positioning to try and assign blame. And I think as that risk of default becomes more real, these conversations will become more real, and nobody wants to be responsible if we, again, we get close to default and the markets go crazy, or people stop spending money and the economy starts to slow down again, or employers start to lay people off. I think that is what will wind up driving this debate. So in some ways it's just the larger external factors that I think will have a big impact on how this plays out. If you'll go to the next slide, Angela. So I do think that the most important thing that we can do as the workforce development field is really make sure that policymakers do understand what's going on with our programs, what's going on with the local community, how it's affecting the employers that we work with and their ability to find the skilled workers that they need, how it's impacting the unemployed people that we're trying to help get a job or get a better job. And I know that I just explained that the sequesters, we won't really feel the impact of the sequesters until later in the summer. But if you think about all the cuts that we have made since 2010, more than $1 billion in cuts from job training programs just since 2010. I do think it's possible to really demonstrate that this sort of steady erosion of funds over the last few years is already having an impact, and once the sequesters go into effect, it will just make what's already happening that much worse. And it's just really important that we're relaying that information and telling those stories. And this is a picture of a map that we, National Skills Coalition, are starting to try and build. It's on our website. If you just go to www.nationalskillscoalition.org, it's on our homepage on the right side of the page where you can just click, and in just a few minutes you can sort of give us a brief paragraph on what's going on with your program or in your local community and how you have seen the previous cuts and what you expect the sequester will do to you or do to your program. And as we can build out this map, will be a very important and useful tool for us to have, to use with the White House, to use with the Senate, and to use with the House to really show them what's going on. So you can see we've got a few stories, but we'd really like to fill this map in and have a lot more stories to tell so that they understand what's going on. And I promise you, healthcare and education and the environment and law enforcement, they're all collecting their stories too. And so if we are not able to tell our story as well as they are, when policymakers have to make these decisions about what programs to cut, if we're the quietest voice in the room, we're the easiest to cut. So again, it's just really important that we keep getting the information up to the policymakers. Go to the next slide, Angela. Next. So you can see, you can follow us, and here's Angela's contact information and my contact information. And if you have things that you want to talk to us about, or if you have questions, we're happy to talk to you individually. But we also have about 15 minutes now, so if there are questions on what we've been just talking about, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Great. Well, thank you. And so if you have questions, please raise your hand on your control panel or type in a question. While people are getting ready to do that, we have a couple questions that have already come in. One of them is, do you expect the Senate to take on WIA reauthorization?
That's a very good question. So there have been a lot of changes on the Senate Health Committee, which is the Committee of Jurisdiction. So at the full committee level, Senator Enzi, who was the ranking member, is now no longer the ranking member. Senator Alexander from Tennessee is the ranking member. Senator Enzi did a lot of work on, I don't know if you remember, there was a draft of a Senate WIA bill in 2011. It sort of fell apart very quickly, and they never even introduced it. But Senator Enzi was one of the people who helped write that bill. Senator Alexander was not involved in that conversation. At the subcommittee level, Senator Murray was the chair of the subcommittee. She has now left that position, and Senator Casey of Pennsylvania is the chair of the subcommittee. So there's just been a lot of shifting of the players, so some of that has got to sort of settle and shake out. Having said that, though, there are conversations that are going on now in the Senate, at least at the staff level, where they are trying to figure out if there's a way to move a bill forward. I think they are interested and aspire to at least get another sort of staff draft version out that maybe people could take a look at. I would not be surprised if we saw that in the next few months. But there's a lot of moving pieces, and so like if Senator Alexander says, I don't have any interest in working on this, clearly that will slow things down. I think they're sort of trying to figure that out. So staff are working on it. It depends in some ways on how other offices react and if there's sort of a bipartisan willingness to move forward.
All right, so we have a question from Carrie Williams. Carrie, I'm going to unmute your line if I can. Yep, unmute your line and go ahead with your question. Carrie? All right, well, okay, so apparently Carrie doesn't have a question. So another question that came in is, when you say the sequester is in effect for the next 9 years, what does that mean for us on an annual basis? That is, we know how it affects us in fiscal year 14, but what does it mean for us in fiscal year 2015?
So we don't know what it means in fiscal year 15, and this is what I was trying to explain, right? So we knew what it meant in 2013, even before it started. We knew it was going to be a 5% across the board cut over 12 months. Sort of, you could sort of guess that if you squeeze that down into 4 months, right? I mean, so you kind of knew what it meant. We'll be able to see what it means for this current year, for fiscal year 14. I'm sorry. In no, fiscal year 13. In fiscal year 14, actually, we don't even know what it means for us in fiscal year 14 or any of the out years, because what I was trying to say is, so the overall funding levels that will be available for appropriations, for example, for the labor HHS education appropriations bill, will go down. And then in the labor HHS education appropriations bill, they fund thousands of programs through that bill, and what they'll have to do is they'll have to figure out, we have less money to work with now to fund all of these programs. There's no rules anymore saying that it has to be spread out equally across all the programs, or it has to come out of this program or that program or that program, or that program is exempt. And so the appropriators, they basically just have $55 billion or less money to work with each year now, and they'll make that decision. And so in theory, they could wipe us out. And they could say, we're just going to get rid of these job training programs, and that will save us $6 billion this year, and we'll count that towards our $55 billion in less money that we have. Now, that's not going to happen. They're not going to wipe us out. But they could cut our funding pretty significantly, just because there's not enough money to go around, and because there have been so many cuts up to now, because so many of the programs, anything that was easy to cut has been cut. Anything that was sort of extraneous, or you know, there were a lot of programs on the books that were unfunded where you could cut them and claim the savings, but you weren't really doing any damage to existing programs. That's all been done now. And so any decision that the appropriators make is a bad decision, and they're just going to have to decide which programs they care the most about and which programs they care the least about. But we can't say with any certainty, we know it will affect job training programs in this way. We're just all going to be in there scrapping, trying to protect our programs, unfortunately, which is a really terrible dynamic to find yourself in. You don't want to see programs pitted against programs, because just nobody wins in that scenario.
All right, just a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them into the questions box on the control panel, or else raise your hand. There was a question that came in, where can we find previous webinars? You can find it on our website at www.nationalskillscoalition.org under resources and audio updates. You can find all the last webinar and previous audio updates are all stored there. I am not seeing any more questions, so I'll take this moment to thank everybody for joining the webinar, and if please visit our website, again, nationalskillscoalition.org, for further updates on what's happening with the federal budget. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.